Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of UBS Road to the Election, an election watch series. I'm your host, Anthony Pastore, and I am very excited to welcome my guest, John Emerson, who's a vice chairman of Capital Group International. John, really nice to have you on the show. Thanks for being with me.
Great to be with you, Anthony. Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. So, John, let's get started right off the bat. We are going to go back to 2 weeks ago or so when President Biden announced that he was going to be dropping out of the presidential race. Certainly, there was a lot of news ahead of that. Will he, won't he? And he did. And then he endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris, who has now become, at this point, the presumptive nominee. Um, Talk about with us how that's really transformed the race itself. Obviously, there's a renewed sort of energy and news flow around it, no matter which side you sit on, and how you think that's likely to develop over the next, 3 months or so until election day.
Well, I think the biggest impact of this decision, and let's just say there has been within the Democratic Party what I guess you could call a relief rally in the last 9 or 10 days around this announcement. But for the last year and a half, I think folks who talk about these elections have been saying this is going to be razor thin, super close, just like the last 5 or 6 presidential elections. We may not know the answer of who wins until several days after. That was not the case before Joe Biden made his announcement. I think that everybody was looking at, you know what, it's looking pretty likely like that Donald Trump is going to win this thing, and there might even be a Republican red wave. And I think as a consequence of what's happened, we're back to too close to call, and will probably be too close to call even the week before the election. And the two dynamics on this right now that are likely to be sustained are the fact that, there always on the Republican side was an enormous enthusiasm of the Trump base, and then there was an enthusiasm gap with the Democratic base. And with the appeal that Kamala Harris clearly has to young people and in particular to African American voters, which were two areas where Joe Biden was having real trouble, you now have, I think, almost a pretty good matchup in terms of enthusiasm and base turnout with both candidates. And of course, we'll be looking at the few handful of swing voters in those 6 or 7 swing states that are ultimately going to decide this thing.
Yes, exactly. And it's always interesting when you get down to the brass tacks on election night when they have the maps of the country. It sometimes even comes down to small counties within some of those swing states. So obviously, that's where both candidates are going to be campaigning and getting those grassroots volunteers out, et cetera. And interestingly, John, one of the things that we've seen in the 2 weeks or a little over 2 weeks since President Biden dropped out and Vice President Harris has really taken the country, by storm in so many ways, is that there's been a little bit of a bump in her favorability rating, but still, as you said, it seems like it's a statistical neck and neck tie between herself and former President Trump. But let me continue on the conversation with you because when we get down to the economic side of the story, do you think, from what we know, I know it's hard to tell because we haven't quite seen her full agenda if she became president, but do you think that Vice President Harris will run on the Biden economy? And if she's able to, um, how do you think that becomes part of the control that she brings for the people?
Well, I think a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, the job for Kamala Harris in the next 3 weeks, particularly going into and coming out of her convention, is to define herself and to set her agenda and to set it in a way that will both, I think, in some senses, reassure people of the steadiness that she's going to move forward on, but also make some differences and clarifications with where she might be different than Joe Biden. And the job of the Republican campaign is to try to kill the baby in the crib before she has a chance to define herself. Get out there and define her. And while there seems to be a little bit of flailing around what name calling will stick or not stick, fundamentally, I think it's pretty clear that their approach is going to be to cast her as a very far left, out of touch with the mainstream, particularly with the mainstream in the swing states in the middle of America, voters of this country, and in part using some of the rhetoric that she used, 4 or 5 years ago when she was running for president in a primary campaign that was very much moving towards the left, and a campaign that Joe Biden won in part because he was viewed as more of a centrist. And I think part of what you're going to hear from Kamala Harris is, that was then, this is now. I have been governing side by side with Joe Biden for the last 3.5 years. And I think she will clearly want to present herself as much more center left than left. And I think that's probably accurate in terms of where she is from a policy standpoint, but with a few slight modifications. And one of them would be, I think it took President Biden a little too long to recognize the pain that inflation was causing. And he'd be out there saying, what are you talking about? GDP is up, inflation's coming down, we have, low unemployment, historically low unemployment, missing the point that most voters are looking at the fact that, I'm spending $150 for this, cart of groceries when I used to spend $100 for it 2 years ago. And I think you'll probably hear from her, my guess is, a little bit more of a focus on combating inflation and dealing with cost increases and housing prices as well, which is a huge element of inflation that impacts people very directly, whether it's rental a cost or just buying a new home. And I think you're going to hear a greater emphasis on getting the cost of living down from her than you might have heard from Joe Biden. So that's an example of sort of similar to Biden 2.0, but with some nuanced changes. And that would be one of the changes I would expect to hear from her.
Right. Thanks, John. And, interestingly, we can go from the economic policies of both candidates to now the foreign policy, which is something obviously that's an extremely important issue, especially with so much geopolitical news that's happening all over the world between Israel, Hamas, Russia, Ukraine. Lots of things happening that any president will have to confront and deal with. So what do Harris's foreign policies potentially look like versus what we've heard and know from former President Trump?
I think that Harris's foreign policies, again, are going to be very much like a Biden 2.0 in certain respects, with a nuance in terms of change. And you have to remember there's only one president at a time. So for the next 6 months, it's still going to be the Biden foreign policy. And that, I'd say, would be dramatically different from Donald Trump in the sense of support for Ukraine, standing up against Vladimir Putin, a commitment to and support of our alliances, and a recognition of the importance of our values-based alliances, such as NATO, such as with our European allies, such as with our allies in Asia, whether it's the Quad or through the AUKUS, Australia, US, UK alliance that's been created. You're going to see very much a continuation of that, of working with and supporting our allies, and a continuation of U.S. engagement abroad. And to put it more in a more broad context, a continuation of the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama focus on the U.S. playing much more of a leadership role abroad. Clearly, the America First, Donald Trump approach, I'm going to end the war in Ukraine in 2 days. The way you do that, presumably, is tell Zelensky he's not going to get any more weapons or aid, so he better sue for peace with Vladimir Putin. Sort of this appeal and relationship he seems to have with, or want to have with Putin and with some other leaders. A disdain for our alliances. I think Donald Trump believes alliances are a pain. They cause the United States, and there's political power to this point domestically. They cause the United States to have to modulate what is in its interest because of concerns about our allies' concerns and all our considerations. And so you're going to see, I think, a pretty big difference there. When I talk about nuanced change from Biden 2.0, an example of that might be the war in Gaza. I mean, Kamala Harris remains intensely committed to Israel's right to defend itself, but she's going to be more open in talking about the impact of the war in Gaza on the Palestinian people. And I think that's something that will help her somewhat. And I don't think this is why she's doing it. I think this is where she comes from, but it'll help her somewhat with getting young people back into the Democratic Party fold. And but at the same time, she condemned protests that are pro-Hamas protests and all that. But that's why I say it's going to be a little bit of a nuanced change there. The Trump campaign is arguing that she's actually anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. Little hard to square that with the fact that she's married to a Jewish man and the first Jewish member of sort of the four principles of any White House: the president, first lady, and vice president, and either for second lady or second gentleman in this case. But I think that's one of the nuanced changes that you'll see. I think that she will be someone who is deeply committed, and this comes back to her approach as an attorney general, to rule of law and sort of pushing that. By the same token, continuing with Biden 2.0, she is not a fan of the International Criminal Court and is opposed to their effort to condemn both Israel and Hamas for war crimes. She's, come out and consistent with the Biden position against that. So again, Biden 2.0 with some nuanced changes in that direction.
Great. Thank you, John. And let me just ask you this one final question. And obviously, as we've heard, and there's been lots of papers written about how one day in politics is a long time. So many things can happen, as we've seen over just the past 2.5 weeks. But from now until November, when on November 5th, when the election is happening, what can we expect on the campaign trail? And what's the voter makeup now versus what you might expect over the coming weeks?
Well, to your point about a day is a lifetime. I mean, think of the black swan events that we've had in this campaign in the last month. You had the disastrous Joe Biden debate that all of a sudden changed things dramatically. You had the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and then you had Joe Biden dropping out, and then you had the immediate coalescing of the Democratic Party around Kamala Harris. So let me just say this. I don't think that's the last of the black swan events that we're going to see in this campaign. So that's point number one. Point number two is, in part because this is such a close election, such an emotional election, such an election that people are paying so much attention to, I think you're going to see the polls going like this. I think, when Harris comes out of the Democratic convention, she'll get a bump from that, just as Trump did from the Republican convention. It was muted a bit by Biden's announcement. But they're both going to make mistakes over the course of the next, 90 to 100 days. There are going to be unknown unknowns or maybe known unknowns that are going to dramatically impact. What if we go to have a full-fledged war in the Middle East as an obvious example of that's in the news every day right now? What if somebody who's in the country illegally and driving illegally hits and kills a schoolgirl? You can just imagine the implications. Or what if a red state Supreme Court does what the Alabama Supreme Court did a few months ago and basically declares an embryo, a person, rendering in vitro fertilization illegal, at least until the state legislature can do something about that? Those kinds of events that we can speculate about, but have no idea whether they'll happen or not, can dramatically shape this thing. So I would say buckle your seatbelts. There's going to be ups and downs for both candidates. I think, assuming there is a Trump-Harris debate, it will probably be the most watched presidential debate in American history. And I'm not sure we're going to know the answer to who wins the election until several days after. And you can bet that if by chance Kamala Harris wins, particularly in a close election, which I think either way it's going to be a close election, I don't think Donald Trump's going to get out there and say, I just want to congratulate Kamala Harris on a really well-run race. I think this election's going to continue, and unfortunately, January 6th may be a preamble to what we might see in the weeks following this presidential election. So the buckling the seatbelt kind of is going to carry us all the way through inauguration day.
Yeah, I wanted to say it's probably not just a standard car seatbelt. It's probably one of those race car driver ones. And put your helmet on as well. I think it's going to be a little bumpy as we get there. But thank you, John. And I just wanted to
Can I
also
make one
remind.
other point about
Yeah,
this,
yeah,
which
please,
is
please.
really important, I think, for our clients to understand and advisors, which is please do not mix your emotions about this election. And there are high, high, high emotions on both sides of this thing with your investment portfolio. For God's sake, stay invested because, it's professionals like those at UBS or us at Capital Group who can modify portfolios to take advantage of the winners, the losers, the obvious policy implications of any changes that may happen on the economy with particular companies, with particular sectors. But at the end of the day, if past is prologue, going all the way back to World War II, the stock market, the S&P 500 is going to be higher when the next president leaves office than it is on the day that they are inaugurated. So for goodness sakes, please stay invested.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm glad you mentioned that, John. And we say here a lot, don't vote at the polls, don't vote with your portfolio. So I think that's
Exactly.
great advice to end us with. John Emerson from Capital Group. Thank you so much, John. Great to have you on the show. And thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And for more information, everybody, make sure you're visiting the website where you found this video, likely ubs.com/election watch. There's lots of great content up there, including other episodes from this series. And you can also make sure you're continuing this conversation with your financial advisor. Until next time, I'm Anthony Pastore. Have a great day, everyone. We'll see you soon.